Today we're going to talk a little bit about what it's like to live with autism, some of the symptoms or challenges that those on the autistic spectrum face on a daily basis. So, as I said last week, the symptoms tend to cluster into three main groups. So they are communication impairments, social interaction impairments, and then restrictive or repetitive type behaviours. So when we're thinking about communication, we're thinking about both verbal and non-verbal communication. So verbal communication, we mean spoken language. So about a third of those on the autistic spectrum are non-verbal and don't speak. But generally, tone of voice can be difficult. So interpreting tone of voice from somebody else or choosing the appropriate tone of voice for what they're wanting to say, but also understanding or interpreting non-literal phrases. So things like, there's no use crying over spilt milk, or so-and-so cut corners on that project. Those types of phrases don't make much sense to somebody on the autistic spectrum because they don't make literal sense. But in terms of non-verbal communication, that can be really difficult as well. So interpreting or using appropriate facial expressions and gestures is really, really difficult, and maintaining eye contact can be quite hard. The second group was social interaction impairment. So again, we're thinking about that in terms of two different things. The first is what we interpret and receive from others, and then what we interpret and express from ourselves. So with others, somebody on the autistic spectrum might find it difficult to interpret or recognise somebody else's emotions or intent, knowing that a conversation kind of takes turns, and also gauging personal space, so standing or sitting an appropriate distance from somebody else. And then in terms of themselves, it's similar. It's interpreting and expressing their own emotion in an appropriate way, feeling quite overwhelmed in social situations, and also being able to seek emotional comfort from others. And then the third group was repetitive or restrictive behaviours. So we're thinking about repetitive behaviours in terms of the body. So tapping, spinning, running back and forth, flapping, but also repetitive behaviours with objects. So spinning wheels, flicking light switches, staring at lights or spinning objects. But it's also important to note that those on the autistic spectrum can often get a sensory overload. So very, very bright lights or very loud noises can often feel quite overwhelming. Can also display some ritualistic type behaviours, so lining objects up in a certain order or tapping them in a certain order, having quite narrow or quite extreme or intense interests in things. And then also routine. So routine is really, really important for a lot of people living with autism, and quite unvarying routine. So having set meal plans each day, certain things that they will wear on each day, places that they go, routes to school. So really not liking spontaneity or change in any way. So they are the three kind of main groups of symptoms for those living with autistic spectrum disorder. Obviously, the symptoms can vary from person to person or where they are on the spectrum. Everybody is an individual, but they're some of the things that quite commonly is shared in autistic spectrum disorder. So then next week, we're going to be talking a little bit about ways that you could help support somebody or just make life a little bit easier for them.